Oh, geez. Cheers. Good to go. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I'll go ahead and get started. Sea level rise is a challenge unlike any other. Over the past century, sea levels globally have risen at a rate that's faster than at any point in at least the past 3,000 years. And the seas will continue to rise for millennia into the future. The impacts, the risks, and the hazards are innumerable. Coastal flooding and erosion, land loss and loss of coastal ecosystems, salinization of soils, groundwater, surface water, impeded drainage, and even permanent submergence. But the sea level rise we've already seen and the sea level rise to come will not happen at the same rate everywhere. And to build resilience, we need scientific understanding of the causes of the spatial patterns of sea level change. And while the wastage of land ice and the warming of the global oceans are certainly the dominant contributor on a global basis, they're not the whole story locally and regionally. So coastal subsidence, which is the sinking of land along the coast, can be a dominant cause of regional sea level rise in many regions of the world ocean. But its drivers, its magnitudes, and its scales remain poorly understood. So today we've brought together a distinguished panel of both scientists and practitioners, who I'll introduce in a moment, to discuss the latest science on how subsidence is being translated to action and how communities are responding to the joint challenges of sea level rise and coastal land loss. Before we get there, I will do some introductions. So I'm Chris Pykush. I'm an associate scientist in the Physical Oceanography department at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, where I've been for the past 6 years, doing research on the physics and statistics of sea level change. And I couldn't have done this panel without the collaboration with my peerless colleague, Ben Hamlington, who is a research scientist in the Sea Level and Ice Group, that's what it is, at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So Ben and I together put this on. But enough about us. I want to introduce our esteemed panel of practitioners and scientists. Our first one of our speakers is Theo Bongarts Lebbe. He is the project manager of CTIES, oh, thanks, at the Ocean and Climate Platform. He graduated with a Master's of Science in Economic Policy and Agricultural Development at the University of La Sorbonne in Paris. He has a background in West African agricultural systems and governance, and his work with the Ocean and Climate Platform began on science-related action, and then on the preparation of the COP25, assisting the Because of the Ocean initiative. And for more than 3 years, he has been the manager of the CTIES project. Yuping Chan is the head of secretariat of the Rising Nations Initiative as part of the Global Center for Climate Mobility. She heads the RNI Secretariat at the Global Center for Climate Mobility. I just said that. Sorry. She has extensive experience with multilateral diplomacy and the UN system, having previously led the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Technology, as well as the policy and regional support teams in the US Office of Counterterrorism. Prior to this, she worked in the UN's Department of Political Affairs and in the New York office of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Before joining the UN Secretariat, she was a diplomat in the Singaporean Foreign Service, and she served at the Singapore Mission to the United Nations in New York, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, overseeing the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. She is a BA from Harvard and a Master of Public Administration from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Hamouda is the president of the National Institute of Oceanography and Fisheries in Egypt. He is also the vice chairperson of the UNESCO IOC. He earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in geology from the universities at Alexandria and Tanta, with a focus on tsunami generation by earthquakes, tectonics, and seafloor mapping, among other topics. He was assistant to the president of the Academy of Scientific Research and Technology, advisor to the Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research, and strategic planning member of the Scientific Research Ministry. Hamouda also contributed to the UN Ocean Decade in Africa, tsunami early warning systems in Egypt, and the IOC Data Buoy Cooperation Panel, and his research is summarized in more than 60 scientific publications. Nadya Vinogradova Shiffer is a program scientist and manager at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA headquarters, where she directs the Ocean Physics Program Science Mission Directorate. She is NASA's lead on the Climate Variability and Change area. She's also a program scientist on all NASA missions related to ocean physics and leads multiple NASA science teams that study the ocean's role in climate, sea level, Earth's energy balance, and the water cycle. Prior to her executive role in government, she worked in industry, academia, and founded a research nonprofit. And she raises 2 young scientists with her husband in Washington, D.C. And finally, Sally Yozel, who's the head and senior fellow and director of the environmental security at the Stimson Center. I've been very repetitive in this write-up, sorry. At the Stimson Center, she leads a team that explores the linkages between environmental degradation, the loss of natural resources, and how these issues can threaten and undermine economic, food, and ecological security of people, community, and nations around the globe. She works with governments, coastal cities, and island states to build resilience in coastal communities threatened by the climate crisis. Yozel oversees the Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Initiative, or CORVI, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, which is a decision support tool that delivers climate assessments and plans of action to leaders and financial institutions. Previously, she oversaw the management of the Our Oceans Conference. She served as a senior advisor to former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and was the Director of Policy and Deputy Assistant Secretary at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. She also led marine programs for the Nature Conservancy and Patel Memorial Institute and worked in the U.S. Senate. She holds an MPA from Harvard University and a BA from the University of Vermont. So, welcome our panel. And without any further ado, I will turn it over to Nadya.
Here and see me. Thank you for nice introductions. Let me see. Let's go to slide 1. I'll click it again. Okay, so it works. We're in business. And I apologize, somebody behind the pole. I feel like you guys in Fenway Park. This is how I watch Red Sox game behind the pole. So at NASA, we love studying planets, and when planet Earth included, mostly for its very dynamic nature. So when we think of planet Earth and the movement in the planet, everything's is on the go. Earth, energy, heat, moisture, carbon, people, money, everything is moving on planet Earth, and even something that's intuitively something that we associate with something stable, like solid Earth and our land, it still exhibits motions up and down. So at NASA, we're trying to build those self-consistent pictures of variation of these motions on different time scales. Sometimes those ruptures appear suddenly, like earthquakes and volcanoes or tectonic rifts. They could be sudden and quite dramatic. And some changes in land could be a little closer to mic. And some changes could be gradual. Like, for example, from years of extractions of water or oil or mineral resources from the ground, causes annual changes in the land motion, or even changes occur on the millennial time scale, thousands-year scales, as Earth rebounds and adjusts to the last previous former ice that we've experienced thousands of years ago. So NASA wants to build this in a consistent way, and how do we do it? What tools do we have? We use satellites. Surprise. So, for example, we use radar altimeters or GNSS, or including GPS satellites. And perhaps one of the most known is INSAR, which stands for Interferometric Synthetic Aperture Radar satellites. And they use this kind of interfering principles when a satellite needs multiple passes that passes over the same area from the same vantage points, and then it combines the signal, the phases, and if the ground moves, you would see the difference in those phases of the wavelengths, and then it's returned back. Then, using some simple geometry and unwrapping those phases, you can convert it to the land displacement map, as you can see on your screen. Here's an example of what happens with the vertical land motion in the California regions, with blue showing a predominant sinking of land and red showing the uplift. So, as Chris mentioned in his introduction, one of the reasons we care about land subsidence is to kind of place the how solid Earth shapes the patterns of relative to land sea level rise. And here's an example. I put some with the local flavor. What happens with the future sea level rise? Not far from here, in an island of Mazara, and it's off the coast of Oman, and going forward all the way up to 2100. And the way we do climate projections of sea level rise, we estimate different contributors to this total height of the ocean column. What happens due to thermal expansion or changes induced by currents, what happens due to addition of extra meltwater, et cetera, but what we don't have right now is a good assessment what happens with the vertical land motion, particularly as we go forward. And if you need more details, what drives the sea level in this neck of the wood, you can check out Chris's paper a couple years ago. A lot of granularity, so you wouldn't be bored. So how can satellite help us in this vertical land motion? Here's a positive example of what we can do with this INSAR satellites, as I mentioned in my previous slides. This is what happens in New York. This is one of the maps that was reconstructed by NASA's sea level change team, led by Brad Buzanga, as well as Ben Hamilton, so he would field all the questions. But for the purpose of this talk, predominant blue means the sinking of land, and we can see on average about 1.6 millimeter per year. But there are some hot spots, like, for example, LaGuardia Airport. Sorry, you ping if you're flying out of there. Then we could see significant sinking in those areas up to 4 millimeters per year. Another example, this is how the relevance of those vertical land motion is to creation of flooding or inundation maps. So this is kind of moving towards the practical application of those academic SAR turbulence geeking out. This is how we can actually produce practical and actionable information, what happens with risk in terms of flooding and inundation. Here's an example, very hot off the press, first public release, an announcement on COP28 for the audience. What happens with the future risk in the island of Kiribati, which is the low-lying island in the Pacific Ocean, which to produce this map, which you see on your left corner, you start with the vertical land motions, and then you link it to potential flooding threshold to estimate what will happen in those areas and how to read this complicated map. So, for example, the map shows that when the flooding threshold is about half a meter, which we expect maybe around 2080 or so in this neck of the woods, then all this area in yellow would be inundated. All right, I wanted to tell you that one of the components to produce these inundation maps is the need to know exactly where the land meets the ocean. And this is where our new mission SWOT comes in. We just launched it a year ago. Here's our first release of the global map of what happened with the height of the ocean surface, as well as the very zoomed in depiction of the surface area in the Persian Gulf, which is right here where we are. All right, I see the big signs of wrapping up. I'm going to skip this 2 slides, and just another plug-in for a nice mission, cannot mention it, that is coming soon in 2024, a joint venture between NASA and Indian Space Agency that would further revolutionize our way we see vertical land motion of all Earth surfaces. Thank you.
And our next speaker will be Sally Osel.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dan, and thank you for that kind invitation. And so incredible to be here with such an impressive group of panelists. So, I have to say that obviously all of us are here at COP because we recognize there's a climate emergency. The scale of the emergency, and the gap in what we're doing to, address this, the emergency, when I read about it and I hear that we are on track for nearly 3 degrees Celsius in warming, I mean, that's frightening. And when I think about what is that devastation really going to do to developing cities, it's enormous. I mean, we're already seeing, such an increase in storms, such increased devastation. I mean, think about just last month, the flavor of the month, what crisis happened last month was, the flooding in Somalia, the continued flooding in Kenya. I think 700,000 people in Kenya have been displaced. And that just is, you could name that from city to city, country to country, all around the world every month. And it's really affecting the lives, the livelihoods, making people and places more vulnerable. And so we need action, and we need action today. And we're going to hear more about that from Theo, about sea level rise and how when we're adapting to, say, for example, sea level rise in these coastal cities, we really need to focus on it in a tailored, context-specific way as we build solutions. One size does not fit all. And we just sort of even saw that in Nadya's slides. So what I want to really talk about today is that how do you design the solutions? Vulnerable countries need comprehensive, localized data, regional and even national data. Do not tell the picture because we know that climate risks are local. So to get a more granular picture of risks, at the Stimson Center where I work, we've developed CORVI, which you nicely introduced, the Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Initiative. And so when we started CORVI 5 years ago, we knew that there was a lot of high localized data available on climate hazards, the storms, data on exposure, the assets, and infrastructure. But what was really lacking was the increasing, information needed about vulnerability at the local level. And, when we talk about that, we're talking about how vulnerable are people, how vulnerable are places. And so what we've done with our CORVI project is we look at, because often in developing countries, by the way, developing countries, island states, they lack the data they need to come up with the solutions. There's a real dearth of data. So what we've done is CORVI looks at 100 different risk indicators, and they look at them across social, economic, and environmental issues. Social, economic, and environmental risks to really assess the vulnerability. So CORVI is now operating in 16 different developing countries around the world and island states. And I'll give you a couple examples of what we've seen and what we've found. So in Chattagram, Bangladesh, for example, where we finished an early assessment recently, it's one of the fastest sinking cities in the world due to groundwater extraction and heavy weight of the buildings there. Over a decade, this is translating into, when you think about it, the height of like a 2-liter bottle of water. So try to imagine what that's going to do to infrastructure over time. Or Belize City, another place where we're doing a corvée, where we are currently, we were just there, and in Belize they have this river delta, and its mangroves are currently the ones that are stabilizing the coastline, really, and protecting the low-lying city from subsidence and coastal flooding. But unsustainable development is happening quickly, which is causing major concerns. Or Madagascar, another place we're doing a corvée. There's subsidence in the Antananarivo Valley, which is the capital of the country, and it's seeing increasingly, as a result, strong tropical cyclones and causing flooding. And I think it's like 13 over the last year. And we're all too familiar with the city, the situation in Jakarta. The Indonesian story where they're literally moving the capital from Java to the island of Borneo due to massive subsidence, and that's going to cost at least $175 billion. So what we've done with corvée is we have really we're looking at the subsidence and other issues from a holistic point of view, looking at it through a holistic lens, as you can see. And again, really integrating the environmental, the economic, and the social risks and vulnerabilities from the land to the sea. We've seen so many common themes in all of these 16 corvées about, emerging vulnerabilities. For example, inadequate waste management, degraded coastal and marine ecosystems, informal housing, and outdated infrastructure. All of these impact what we're talking about today. And subsidence is one of the issues we keep hearing about that is just being compounded by with the vulnerabilities. And I'll give you one example in Belize City, where they're having this rapid population growth as migrants flee in from neighboring countries devastated by climate and other social issues. And the growth is increasing the construction of informal settlements, resulting in the loss of mangroves, destroying the natural protections and the sea level rise and subsidence. When you bring all that together, it's just such a significant problem. And then you add on top of that the lack of wastewater collection, wastewater management, which further damages the last existing mangroves that there are. And then so governments are really on the front line of the climate emergency. They're stepping up to these challenges with adaptation planning, but financing remains the major missing piece of the puzzle. We know that from the UNEP's recent report, that gap is from $215 to $387 billion each year. We heard great news earlier this week with the new loss and damage fund that was announced. Bezos announced more money yesterday. There's a lot of funds that are being announced this week, and we need to continue that and use all of these resources wisely. So let me just close by saying that to address sea level rise, subsidence, and other issues, we have to remember climate change is local. We have to understand and monitor locally at the local issues to really create the plans moving forward, because all of these drivers, all of these risks are connected, and the responses need to be equally connected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. And our next speaker is Théophile.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So I work for the Ocean Climate Platform, and I manage a project called Sea Ties that we launched 4 years ago. Just after the release of an IPCC report on ocean and cryosphere, with a specific chapter on sea level rise, underlying the huge consequences, especially for coastal cities. And so we wanted to dedicate the specific project on this, because we had this feeling that coastal cities were not prepared. And even some coastal cities networks were not really integrating the specific risk for coastal cities facing sea level rise. So, and of course, where we have subsidence, the consequences will be the same. So what I want to do today is to present you the conclusion of this project that are in this document, where we are proposing recommendation for coastal mayors, for local elected at the regional level, for countries also and parties, if there are some negotiators in the audience and parties representatives. And so before presenting you the conclusion of this document, I just want to say a word about the methodology. We really had science in the DNA of the project. So we started with a multidisciplinary approach of what can be a sustainable way to adapt coastal cities. So we worked with oceanographers, physicians, etc., but also with historians, anthropologists, ecologists, sociologists, etc., to really understand the phenomenon, but also the impacts for the population living on the coast. We published a paper in Frontiers in Marine Sciences. And it's a synthesis of the knowledge that we have and the different science have on how we can adapt coastal cities. That was the first step. In the second time, based on this, we could organize 5 regional workshops because sea level rise, it's a global phenomenon. And so we wanted to understand what are the consequences in different regions of the world, in different cities of the world, and which kind of solution the people will develop. So on the west coast of US, in the city of Santa Cruz, and partners from other cities from the west coast. In West Africa, specific impacts in West Africa and specific solutions that have been developed. In Mediterranean, Northern Europe, and finally with the 16 countries from the Pacific region, and specific also states as they are islands. So now the document is supported by more than 80 organizations around the world, and here are the main priorities. The first one is on solutions, and which kind of solution we can implement. And of course, it's local context, as Sally underlined, but it's also about choosing what we will have to protect when we cannot do anything else, and where we will have to remove and to manage retreat. That will be the future. We have to be clear with that. And this document is helping policymakers to do those difficult choices. And after we have a range of different solutions that we will have to combine. A second focus was really on social justice. And in every discussion we had, in every workshops, every cities, we know that adaptation will emphasize inequalities, will create climate gentrification. The poorers will be the losers. It was in the IPCC for a long time. It's true for adaptation in general. It's true for coastal cities adaptation even more because you have a lot of population, economical states, etc. So we are proposing here some recommendations to include the population and all stakeholders in the process and design a desirable future, like this expression. Like we have to envision something in a society where every people, every economic actors can live in a good way. Next is a priority on finance. I will not develop it here today because I want to be more specific on the knowledge part. So on the finance, briefly, Sally, you underlined the huge gap and that the ocean is the less funded SDG adaptation, the same, etc. But on finance, what is important is that we will have to change the way we are financing coastal adaptation to finance it on the very, very long term, because adaptation is a long journey. It will not be financing a 4 years project, but it will be financing it it will be financial perpetuation. And that's difficult, and that's the message we want to share with funders, we as multinational development banks, etc., etc. On knowledge, what I want to say, and after we conclude with that, is that, of course, we will need to collect more and more data and observation data, what you presented, but there is a lot of things that we cannot see on the ground, and so we will also have to combine it with the integration of local knowledge, sometimes indigenous knowledge, etc., etc. So we are proposing here some methodologies to have those people on board, and I just want to underline some ideas. First, there are some gaps. There are some disciplines that have to be more involved in the adaptation field. Legal law in general. It's very important that legal research ensure the alignment among different legal domains. For example, I'm thinking to housing, transport on the coast, maritime transport, agriculture, industry. They have to be aligned to be sure that the adaptation strategy can be implemented. That's super important. Second, the economic feasibility of solutions. It's a huge point, and even the feasibility of the different solution itself. For example, nature-based solution. Here we are, I'm sure that on a lot of other pavilions, we are talking a lot about nature-based solutions, but it's difficult to be convinced about nature-based solution where you are a mayor, if you're a mayor and you really have to protect your population. So that's a key point and a key challenge for science. Last, I think that science in general, and I focus on science because we are here, a lot of scientists are represented, so it's important to foster the appropriation of the knowledge. We can first boost experimental projects and try to find a way to incorporate and collaborate more with non-academic actors. We can develop serious game, participatory photographic observatories. It's just examples, of course. Citizen science, prospective. That's a way to have non-state, non-scientific actors in the loop. And finally, ensure the accessibility of the scientific knowledge through a specific language that will be understandable by everyone, through data sharing, VR. I have some example I will develop later if you want on how Santa Cruz is using VR to communicate art and culture. I stop here because it's thank you. After, it's you.
Thank you very much, Théophile. Our next speaker will be Yuping.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm just going to pick up a little bit on what Theo has spoken about, this idea not moving just from cities, but also to countries. So I come from the United Nations, where the Rising Nations Initiative is led by the countries at the forefront of the climate crisis, facing the greatest threats of sea level rise, basically total inundation of their countries in the near future. So we're talking about the Pacific Atoll Islands of Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Marshall Islands. And the countries have really been imploring the international community to take action. And at the United Nations, my specific program looks at addressing the existential threat, because it is a threat to their very existence, the complete inundation of their land by rising seas. And so the project, and I'm wondering if I could have the slide up quite quickly. Oh, yes. Looks at various aspects of this specific issue by looking at the impacts that have been raised, but actually not just the impacts that Sally had mentioned, but issues that go even further in international relations. So questions around state sovereignty, questions around the loss of heritage. So for instance, should a country lose all its territory due to land territory due to rising sea levels, what then does that mean for the sovereignty of the state? The definition of a state in international law, for instance, is defined on land currently. So what does this mean for countries whose very existence is threatened by the rising sea levels? Then also the question of culture and heritage. In the same way that we talked about the vulnerability of these countries, cities and so forth, what we need to think about is the vulnerability of Pacific Island cultures, in which their culture and heritage is intrinsically tied to their land and their seas. So what happens then to the very identity of a country, its culture and heritage, when that is potentially lost due to rising seas? So at the United Nations, we really are also asking these types of questions, and what kind of steps are needed from the international community to ensure the protection of such heritage. What has happened is that through the Rising Nations Initiative, for instance, Tuvalu has taken groundbreaking steps internationally to secure global recognition of the threat that is posed by seeking for Tuvalu to be designated a World Heritage Site under the UNESCO Heritage Convention, and is really also asking for that type of global recognition and support to protect its island culture, completely unique. And this is the same for a lot of other Pacific atolls, where their island culture is unique to each island, and even within each island nation itself, depending on the remote atolls, they also have developed communities, island communities, that have distinct types of health, heritage, and culture, different types of singing, fishing practices, language, traditions, all of which are tied to the land and are in danger of vanishing precisely because of rising sea levels. So these impacts on essentially the most vulnerable countries, developing countries, have to be recognized and acted upon by the international community. So that's where the Rising Nations Initiative, which is part of the Global Center for Climate Mobility at the United Nations, works on addressing these issues. This has also become a priority at the United Nations. Some of you may or may not be following the United Nations General Assembly, where the current president of the General Assembly, who is from Trinidad and Tobago, has emphasized the need for the global community to address questions around statehood, the lack of legal certainty around the boundaries, the maritime boundaries of countries that are threatened by sea level rise, and what exactly the international community needs to do around this. So there are a lot of questions and implications beyond just the scientific, which is very important, but also not just for coastal cities and perhaps countries that are more equipped to deal with these issues, but for those that are most vulnerable and literally, as I said, at the front line, what are the issues that need to be confronted and how can the international community come together urgently to address it? The last thing I want to close on quite quickly, and I'm quite open to discussing this further because I think there are a lot of interesting aspects where we could really benefit from the intersection of science with policy making as well as politics as well, is what Sally had mentioned, that in some ways, we need locally based data and science to inform how we make decisions in these issues. And in that regard, I'm going back to what Nadya had mentioned, that there will be a report on Kiribati that will be launched shortly, which is a collaboration actually between NASA and the Rising Nations Initiative, where we're precisely trying to address this gap between data that is particularly contextualized and addressing the situation that's faced by these countries. So Nadya and Ben actually traveled with the Rising Nations Initiative to Funafuti, Tuvalu in June of this year, where we discussed the implications with the local government, met with stakeholders, and really sought to analyze what does it mean to have data that can inform local policymaking and how these types of global observations from satellites can really help decision makers locally and local actors understand the science and then apply that in policymaking. So they have actually issued a technical assessment on sea level rise and its implications for Tuvalu. They're doing the same for Kiribati, as Nadya has mentioned, and we're also engaged in discussions with regional communities, scientific communities, such as the SPC, the Pacific Community, to really look at how global data must also be informed by regional approaches as well as a deep understanding of the Pacific region. Because indeed, there are coastal cities, there are countries that are low-lying, but the situation in the Pacific is very unique given the spread, the geographical spread, the nature of the islands, the tradition of the people, and a lot of what has to be done must exactly be tailored to that specific context. So that is where I think I would end on this idea that the Pacific is unique, but the Pacific also needs to be prioritized in global discussions. I think many of you following the discussions here at COP will know that there has been a lot of emphasis on these issues, and the Pacific community, the AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, is really pressing forward for the international community to recognize the unique peril that they're facing and to really respond to their urgent pleas for action. That is where I think the international community needs to step up. Very briefly, I know I said I would end, but I just want to add one little extra point. Theo had mentioned how adaptation, long-term adaptation is important. And that is where I think also for the case of Pacific, they face a very unique situation, right? They are facing total uninhabitability of their lands due to rising sea levels. So what are the adaptation measures that have to be put in place to ensure the habitability of their atolls? Tuvalu, again, has taken very bold and courageous steps in calling for a long-term adaptation plan that is groundbreaking in many ways, informed by science and data, but really looking at how they, the people, can stay on their lands for as long as possible. This long-term adaptation plan of Tuvalu, which was actually launched by the Minister of Climate last year at COP, is something that is going to be addressing this fundamental questions of existence and looking at how we can preserve the sovereignty and statehood of Tuvalu into the future. He will be actually presenting Tuvalu's long-term adaptation plan at the Climate Mobility Pavilion on the 6th of December at lunchtime. So if you're interested in this precise intersection of science, data, policy making, adaptation for what is the country that stands at the front line of the climate crisis, I would really encourage all of you to attend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yuping. And finally, we'll have Amr.
Okay, I can come, okay? The last one to be stand. Okay. 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 And the movie you can work here?
Yep, so you click twice.
Okay. Okay. So it's an honor to be here with you, and thank you very much for Zul and Peter for support us, and give me a chance to be here with all the professional panel that we are here, that we are with you now. So what I talking now, we're talking about Alexandria City. We have two challenge about Alexandria City of the case study about what is the impact of the hazard of the sea level rise and also the disaster related to the earthquake and tsunami. So we have a two challenge now. We have a recent Alexandria, and we have also sinking Alexandria. So we are working about two lines parallel. We needed to protect the recent Alexandria from the sea level rise that we are talking from Johnson in the COP26. This is speak about Alexandria will be sinking in the future if we don't make a protection from shore protection about Alexandria. So we can go back to the history. So we can see this pointer here. As you can see here, we have an island here in the sound. Is Faros. It's separated from the shore, but Alexander Sea, we needed to build the bridge to connect this island to the shore of Alexandria and build this Alexandria city. And with this, we have two harbor here for, as you here can imagine, this is the harbor here of Alexandria, and this is here the castle of Cleopatra. And we can say here about this is the library which will each burned by Caesar, which will be occupied at Alexandria. So this is, we can go back to understand, this is the previous shoreline. And now, this is the recent shoreline. We have a shoreline here, which will be covered, and all this will be occupied by the building, and we have this, the recent shoreline. So you can imagine the situation of ancient Alexandria, and down we have a recent Alexandria about the harbor, eastern harbor of Alexandria. So this is the part of eastern harbor of Alexandria. So we can imagine what we have, the recent and the sinking archaeology, which will be detecting by marine geophysical survey. We are working about that, and the detection about the ancient harbor, so we can build here, as you can, you can see the movie here, we can imagine then 3D about the sinking of the harbor of archaeology, which will be done by side scan sonar, and also we are doing some seismic to detection what is the benefits of archaeology, which will be sinking here. We have a huge amount of archaeology, so it is needed highly financed to get out this sinking archaeology to be up and building the new construction. So what we're thinking about how we can using this in the future, what we are doing that in the future. So we needed to can imagine to build this harbor and collected all the sinking archaeology pattern to build the sinking archaeology, and after dredging, and we prepare that. This is depend about the finance for doing that, and we hope to get some additional finance to start it about this. What we are needed to build this sinking archaeology, and we needed to be returned the sinking harbor of the eastern harbor that we needed. For this is the second item that we have. We have here is the Biblioteca of Alexandria, which we established now. In the same place of the library that we burned by Caesar in the history, and we are thinking another something. We are a boat, and we are taking a teleferic to go down to see all the sinking archaeology after will be established underground after the dredging. So this is our dream now, working about that. This is some part we are collected here. That's from the ancient archaeology. We needed not get out until now. So we needed to prepare the sinking harbor again to this idea to be established for making this sinking archaeology to be all the people to see what is the sinking harbor inside, because we don't have finance to get this harbor up. So we needed to build this sinking in the sinking museum to be invited all the people which will visit Alexandria to see what we have in Alexandria. Thank you very much.
All right, I want to thank the panelists for their remarks. We have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. You're welcome to raise your hand, and we have a microphone to be passed around. Maybe while people are thinking of their questions, I can start with one. So we heard a lot from the speakers about localization of data, and I think there's two parts of this. One is actually producing that data, getting the information that is very local, this high resolution. The other part is delivering that information and actually getting it into the hands of those that need it the most. I'm interested to hear some perspectives about the challenges on both of those. The challenges of producing it on large scales where it's needed most, and also delivering it. And Sally, maybe to start with you, I think with the Corvi work that you're doing, you're confronting both of those. But I'd be interested to hear about some of the challenges that you're facing and kind of getting that information into the hands of stakeholders in the communities you're working.
Great question. And we've learned so much since we initially started Corvi. I mean, you can't just be a research institution in Washington, D.C. and show up in these, local communities and island states and say, we're here to help you. What is so important is to work with the local communities, the local governments, the national governments, get that buy-in so you can get the data that exists. And when there is no data, what we have been using is structured expert judgment, which literally it's a social science tool, but we get like the best and the brightest folks on the ground across, like I said, the 100 different risk indicators. And they do surveys, they do interviews, and we have been using a lot of universities and students, in fact, to pull that together. And then we have a process that pulls all that together and prioritizes the risk. And then we write a report that describes it. So it's not just a bunch of numbers. And then, in addition, we add solutions. In fact, we've done some work in Kiribati. Just recently, we were with the UN ambassador to Tuvalu. So, we urge all of us to work together, because I'm really excited about what I've been hearing. Because our work is not going to be as granular. I mean, we're providing granular data when it doesn't exist, but not as granular as, say, some of what we've seen here today. So it's so important for all of us, get that local data, get the local buy-in, and find the greatest experts.
And Theo and Nadya, maybe you could speak to some of the challenges of generating that information, that very localized information that is ultimately needed, the data on things like subsidence, but also maybe more broadly on sea level rise.
Sure, thanks, Ebeth. Well, in terms of data availability, all U.S. government data, NASA, NOAA data, is free and open. Anybody who has Wi-Fi or internet connection can get the data. So there should be no data accessibility issues. Now, interpreting this data or localizing it or downscaling it to the scales that you want, that's a separate issue. And this is something that we work hard with our engineers, and we push them to high resolution, more robust data, more frequency, more repeatable. So this is something that we work hard as an agency. I think today we are pushing our observing system to the new frontiers. And as Sally said, that if you do not have information from one sensor, you use all available information that is out there. You downscale, you use models, you use expert opinion, you extrapolate. You just synthesize a variety of digital information that is out there to produce knowledge that is most relevant for the stakeholders that you're working with.
Sorry. Okay. So we need, of course, those data, satellite data, and then I will complete the answer at the more local level. I think that I have some interesting examples to include the population, to collect another kind of data, sometimes historical, for example, that can be very useful. For example, in France, a program wanted to collect old pictures of a family living on the coast to see exactly where was the sea level years ago, some decades ago. And it was very helpful also to convince the population and facilitate the acceptance of the difficult solution that we will have to implement, and show to the population that because of artificialization, of climate change, and because we are really developing our economy and our cities on the sea, and we forget about the mobility of the sea in some places, estuaries, etc. So it was also a very interesting way to collect data. And another one is VR. I was briefly touching upon. It was a way to show which kind of solution we could develop, and what will be, how it will look like if we put a nature-based solution, a wall, etc. So it was really a way to involve the population. I think it's very important. That's always the more difficult. And I think to do that, we also need time, and we have to anticipate this very long time. And in the workshop in Santa Cruz, some representatives of very local communities talk about the time of trust. And we do not trust scientists like this. We do not trust our politicians like this, and it needs times to get the confidence in science and climate change, etc., to then act.
That's great, thanks. Question? Yeah.
Thanks, this was a great panel. My name is Tali Vardy, and I'm from the Coral Restoration Consortium. And I had a panel yesterday with some youth from Kiribati, Vanuatu, and Fiji. And actually, our member from Tuvalu couldn't come because using the NOAA Coral Reef Watch bleaching data, he realized that this coral bleaching event was coming, and he stayed back to actually rescue the corals and put them in these nurseries with shading. So I sense what a humongous risk these places are at. And I'm just wondering, from your work with governments, is it really, are they asking for more data, or and a lot of times, do they just need help mitigating kind of, their island nations and just doing the work?
I think it's twofold, right? So data is important because data allows us a basis on which to act. But you are right that for many of them, they know what is a daily occurrence. They've seen the impact of sea level rise, the impact on their crops, their homes, their vegetation, their coral reefs, their marine fish stocks, basic things like in Tuvalu, for instance, right? Because of the failure of crops, they have to import food in. It's horrendously expensive. They drink soda because there's not that much fresh water. As a result, their incidence of NCDs, diabetes, cholesterol is astronomically high. I think, if I'm not wrong, health referrals is 50% of the government budget. So they live this emergency every single day. So you're right, in some ways, it's really not just about the data, but it's about what can we do now. It's not even about mitigation. I think we're now at the adaptation phase, and you can hear it in the voices of the Pacific here, from the youth, from the leadership, that there really needs to be urgent action and prioritization of these countries right now, and really the international community coming together to think about what can be done, what should be done. I hear all these calls for climate justice, climate action, and putting a face on that and recognizing that these countries truly stand at the precipice of this total catastrophe, this existential crisis is, in essence, is essential.
What I can add it also, it's very important. We needed as a regional to understand what is the regional shore in the ancient history is on, not needed to working as separate. So we understand, so we can, for example, for the Mediterranean, we need to understand what is the previous shore. We have it. So we can imagine what is the risk will be with the date, with the time from long history until now. How is the shoreline is movement. So we can see what we have now and what we can lose in the previous, so can understand what is the long time period for this cycle. To understand this is not done by separated, but it will be needed a community for the regional in each part of the country. Thank you.
So that's such a great question. I think it was the Prime Minister of Tuvalu who said that, they are really facing a climate war every single day. And when you think about that, what does that even mean? What are they including in that war? Well, just to give an example of Kiribati, they rely completely on fisheries access agreements, funds they get from foreign fishing to keep their economy afloat. And we, in so many of the countries, island states that we've been working in, tourism is the number one. Got totally wiped out, as we know, during COVID, excuse me. So it's so important for this diversification of their economies. And then, just obviously, resilience is more than just physical changes. It's literally changing the way the people, bringing in their culture, but changing their economies to help them sort of have the funds and access. And then I think the other piece of that that we're hearing this week, which is great because we've been fighting for this for a long time, is to get the data to the financial folks. They're the ones that have not felt confident in putting the money where it's needed most. And so it may not be the data that the island needs. They live it every day, but it's the data that some of these financial institutions need, public and private, and I think that's where a lot of focus needs to be.
I absolutely agree. And when I was in the Pacific, to answer your question about what the states need, naively, I thought the IPCC will be the answer to everyone at the beginning. I thought it was my Bible, my Quran. I don't know, but it's not helpful when you are a city or a country you want to adapt. So they were working with a LIDAR technology. It's teledetection. It's not a satellite, but it's a plane. It's excellent. You can see exactly the topography of your coast, your land, but it's super expensive. And so the first thing they need, it's someone to finance it. So we are all here with good ideas and our will to change things, but we also need the funders to be in the loop of those discussions. Yeah.
Other question?
Yeah, good morning or afternoon, everyone. My name is Farhat Mbaruk from Zanzibar, a small island in Tanzania. I'm very happy to be in this discussion because we are impacted by climate change. Our island is disappearing. The adverse impact on climate change are affecting fisheries, agriculture, and tourism. So I'm very happy to be in this discussion. I would like to carry forward the discussion with the Corvi. Corvi, I think you're working with the community. You're working to see how the impact, how the scale of impact. And I think, Theo, you talked about the sea ties. I think it will be very good after this panel of discussion, we can have a talk, because I think we need help. We need to know the acceleration of erosion that is taking place and what solution is to be done to save our island. We're 1.8 population and we're impacted by climate change. So I would really like to carry the discussion after this panel of discussion. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you. Very good presentation from all impressive panelists. My name is Dia from the Ministry of Marine Affairs Indonesia. So I'm thinking that we are talking about the sinking and the issue of the climate change issues, and the impact of the sea level is real, and then. And I see that addition to my colleagues' information that the data and science to support the proof that the sea level rise is there is also needed and already good presented by NASA. And my question is how can we deliver this message to the decision maker? I saw that Theo report about the policy recommendation also mentioning about your solution to the local, national, and regional decision maker. But how we can deliver the message that the climate change impact, the sea level is there, is real to the government, so they can make a real action to have a solution for this issue. And then moreover, how can we deliver this message to this COP28 that ocean is matter, that sea level is real? That is my question. Thank you.
I have the mic, so I can start. Well, it's advocacy work, so it's very difficult. It's being here today to talk to the policymakers in a lot of different pavilions also, and also proposing concrete recommendation to parties and negotiators to include sea level rise in different programs. It can be in the UNFCCC discussions. For example, there is a Nairobi work program, which is a group of experts gathering themselves and proposing recommendations to policymakers and parties at the UNFCCC. So we are part of it, for example. We also need to include those recommendations in the global goal for adaptation, in the loss and damage. And that's the role of the negotiator of each country. So we have to communicate those information to the countries. There are some groups, of course, of countries interested by ocean-related discussions. And the Ocean Climate Platform, that's not my job, but the job of my organization, the Ocean Climate Platform, to deliver this kind of information. We have to do that in UNFCCC. Also in the CBD on biodiversity. Last COP was in Montreal last year. Same, there is a global framework for biodiversity, and we have to address those recommendations. We also have scientific opportunities to address those messages. There is an ocean and climate dialogue each year in preparation of the COP, where scientists are proposing and underlying the best conclusion and result of science to inform policymakers and share those important messages. And finally, I think the SDGs. And in 2 years, for example, there is an important conference on the ocean, on the ocean SDGs, UN Ocean Conference, and that's a unique opportunity also to inform policymakers on this. It will be in UNOC, so 2025, a special event on sea level rise, where cities and a coalition of cities will be launched to adapt to sea level rise. So if it's an important subject for you, we have 18 months to think about this coalition and which message we want to deliver, which cities want to be in the loop, and construct that together.
Just very quickly on the political point. So you're totally right. It's about the political action. And in some ways, it starts from negotiating documents here at the COP. The current General Assembly president actually has recently convened an informal thematic debate of the General Assembly in New York, where all 193 countries were called to discuss this issue of sea level rise and the existential threat they face. There's also been, quite recently at the General Assembly in New York, the launch of a coalition on sea level rise and addressing its existential threat, CSAT, that's actually supported by the Global Center for Climate Mobility and comes out of a lot of the global advocacy work that we're doing around sea level rise in these international types of forums, in UNESCO, so not just in UNFCCC and these climate policy-related forums, but also looking at it across the board. What should the General Assembly be doing? What should the Security Council be doing? You might be aware, for instance, that earlier this year in February, Malta, during its presidency of the Security Council, actually held an open thematic debate on sea level rise. And there are groups of countries that are starting to really look at how this is related. For instance, in climate and security, there will be potentially more and more of this political movement around the United Nations really pushing for action on sea level rise.
All right. Yep, go ahead. Chris, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So I just want to, are we on? Yeah. Just want to say, to give a little historical perspective on what you're asking about, how do we get oceans more focused globally on the policy issues. In 2015, at the COP, there was no ocean pavilion. The word ocean was barely, we had to fight when I was at the State Department to even put the word ocean into the protocols that were being discussed. We've come a long way, and we should, thanks to Woods Hole, Scripps, and Bloomberg, the many others who sponsored the Ocean Pavilion. And let's hope we'll have an Ocean Pavilion onward. And just yesterday, for example, at the Unlocking the Blue Pacific Prosperity Initiative, which is a fund that was announced by Bezos, there you saw, and then there's the Jeff funding, but there you saw that, all the leaders from the Pacific Island nations, John Kerry stood up there and talked at length about the linkages of the ocean, fisheries, and climate. And so we need to have more of those discussions, but I can just trust me, having been around in these issues for a long time, we have come a long way, and we've got the UN Ocean Conference, the Our Ocean Conference, several other, the UN Ocean Decade of Science. There's so many great platforms that are taking these issues forward. And so we've come a long way. We've got a long way to go. But, we should feel good about where we're going and what we're accomplishing as far as raising these issues up to politicians and policymakers.
So we've been given 2 flashes of the wrap it up sign, so I think that's a sure sign to wrap it up. I want to thank Chris for pulling the panel together. He did all the hard work. I kind of just showed up here. If we could thank our panelists once again for the great remarks and the discussion.